All right, this is thrilling. Hello, I'm Rebecca DeSchweinitz, an Associate Professor of History here at BYU, and as I welcome you to the History Department's third annual Book of the Year discussion, I would like to acknowledge that Brigham Young University sits on the traditional homelands of diverse tribal populations, nations, including the Timpanogos, Ute, Shoshone, Goshute, and Paiute. We pay respect to their ancestors and elders and pledge ourselves to the work of healing hearts and lands for future generations and for building the kingdom of God. This year, our book of the year is Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood, published by Deseret Book just this spring in 2023 and authored by BYU history alum Paul Reeve. We're very proud of him. The book we chose for our students and faculty and some of our specific classes to engage with this year, and that is the topic of our conversation today, addresses issues of race, belonging, history, memory, and family. And it features the voices of individuals long neglected in the stories that we tell about the past, including about Latter-day Saint history. This is purposeful. It is one way we are answering the call of modern prophets and apostles and of BYU leadership to root out racism, to promote what President Oaks has called the eternal truth that Black lives matter, and to better understand, as President Nelson put it, the pains of racism and prejudice of our Black brothers and sisters the world over. As Dr. Reeve suggests in this book, history as a discipline is uniquely positioned to lead out in the important work of breaking down the ideas and frameworks and divisions that have limited our potential to build Zion, taking us through the historical record, bringing together evidence from a range of sources. He separates myths and misunderstandings, misrememberings and assumptions from facts and history. Professor Reeve shows there were initially no racial barriers in the church, that racial restrictions developed over time and in tension with restored truth and the available historical evidence, and that the 1978 official declaration marked a return to the church's original universalism, Joseph Smith's and our Savior's, teaching that the human family in all of its diversity is equal in God's sight. Equipped with an understanding of the past, Dr. Reeve says, each of us becomes accountable in the present for our attitudes and actions, as well as an agent of change for the future. This book asks us to engage with subject matter that, as Dr. Reeve puts it, makes God weep, or as Orson Pratt explains, angels blush. It's the kind of history that really matters, and it's hard. It gives us opportunities to engage our minds, our hearts, and our souls, and to consider the significance of gospel principles like agency, forgiveness, and repentance. We know that some of you here today have read the book, others have not, and that you come with diverse experiences with and understandings of the church's racial past and present, and likely with different comfort levels in dealing with such hard topics, especially as they relate to our own faith tradition. We hope that this is an uplifting and inspirational experience for all of you. In the foreword to this book, Black pioneer Darius Gray, I think fittingly, talks about the tears and the road rash that might come from engaging with this history. And this is a metaphor that I can totally understand because I still have scars from crashing on my bike and getting road rash when I was 13. But Brother Gray promises it also comes with good news, great news, if we will but embrace it. We'll start by giving Dr. Reeve time to share some initial remarks about the book. We've also invited another BYU history graduate, Grace Soelberg, to talk about some of her experiences in uncovering and grappling with race in Latter-day Saint and BYU history. Then we'll have a current history student, Jonah Harris, engage our panelists in a series of questions. And we might also be able to engage with some of your questions. And one of my colleagues will be passing out index cards. We're going to do this old school, so you'll write your question and kind of pass them back, and we'll kind of go through and look at some of those and hope to incorporate some of those questions. Just a little bit more to introduce our speakers. Paul Reeve is the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he teaches courses on Utah history, Mormon history, and the history of the U.S. West. His book, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, received multiple awards. He's published other work as well, but I'll just mention that he is the project manager and general editor of a digital database, Century of Black Mormons, which is designed to name and identify all known Black Mormons baptized in the faith between 1830 and 1930. Grace Soelberg graduated from Brigham Young University in history in 2021 with minors in sociology and Africana studies. Her honors thesis, Peculiar Students of a Peculiar Institution, a historical analysis of racial minority students and race relations at Brigham Young University, as presented in the Banyan, which was the yearbook, from 1911 to 1985, won the William J. Snow Award in American West and Latter-day Saint history. Soelberg is currently a first-year MA student at the University of Utah. Her research centers on the political and cultural exchanges between East Asia and African America in the 20th century. And then finally, Jonah Harris is a senior from Oceanside, California, majoring in history. In addition to his studies, he works with BYU's Sorensen Center for Ethical and Moral Leadership and is helping with research on the BYU Slavery Project. After graduation, he plans to pursue a doctorate in American history and is interested in writing easily digestible books that help the general public engage with sound, responsible history. Imagine that. Okay, Paul, we'll turn it to you.
Well, thank you, Professor DeSwinich. I want to begin today by expressing my gratitude to Professor DeSwinich for the invitation and to the BYU Department of History as a whole for the selection of Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood as the book of the year. In contemplating this honor, I've been flooded with a variety of memories, and it took me back to my undergrad days at BYU. I started school at BYU fall semester 1989 with the intent to major in accounting. By winter semester 1991, I had decided to declare as a history major. I had no plan for what I was going to do with a degree in history. I just decided I wanted to take classes in a subject I enjoyed. That was my plan. I enrolled in the first 3 history courses on my undergrad transcript that semester and earned 2 A's and a C+. It was an entry-level U.S. History Survey course, and I earned a C+. What indeed was I doing as a history major? If you would have told me winter semester 1991 that I would go on to write a book in the first place, and then that a book I wrote would be selected by the history department as this book of the year, while I struggled for a C+ in Professor Hill's entry-level history course, I would have laughed in disbelief. My message to you undergraduates is twofold. First of all, grades don't define you, and following your heart, even though it may not be the logical option, can sometimes surprise you. You can't always see where your heart and your dreams might lead. Unexpected paths and beautiful vistas sometimes appear out of nowhere and offer new perspectives that the best laid plans could have never fathomed. I could have never fathomed in 1991 that I would be here today. It is truly an honor to personally thank the department that launched my training into a subject that I continue to enjoy. I learned what it means to be a historian from among the best that the discipline has to offer. James Allen, Tom Alexander, Fred Gowans, Neil York, Martha Bradley Evans, Brian Cannon, Douglas Tobler, Paul Heyer, Philip Flammer, Frank Fox, Malcolm Thorpe, David Montgomery, Carlton Marlowe, Ted Warner, and yes, even Marvin Hill for giving me a C+ in an introduction to the type of academic rigor that the discipline demands. These men, and one single solitary woman, shaped my understanding of the discipline in important ways. I hope that my own scholarship honors what they taught me in some small way. Professor DeSwinich asked if I might spend a couple of minutes and talk about the origins of the Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood book, then its structure, and then a little bit about its methodology. So its origins go back to 2018 when Lisa Roper, who happens to be here in the room, thanks for coming, Lisa, the editor at Deseret Book approached me and told me about a new series Deseret Book was imagining, a book, Let's Talk About, and then let's talk about a variety of potentially controversial topics. Let's talk about polygamy. Let's talk about Book of Abraham. Let's talk about Book of Mormon translation. And it was designed, she said, to provide accessible and short introductions to potentially controversial topics. I was intrigued by the series and encouraged that Deseret Book was contemplating it. But at the same time, I also was skeptical, and I expressed that skepticism to Lisa at the time, that Deseret Book would be willing to publish something that I wrote on the topic, because I felt like we needed to be open and honest, and I was skeptical that Deseret Book was willing to go where I felt the topic needed to go. And to Lisa's credit and Deseret Book's credit, she said that's exactly what Deseret Book wanted to do and encouraged me to give Deseret Book a try. And, over the course of several conversations and a few years, we did eventually come up with this book. That was 2018, and this is 2023. Deseret Book told me at a variety of moments as the manuscript was winding its way through the approval process that it was unprecedented in terms of the approval process. And Lisa continued to encourage me to stick with it, and I didn't believe it until I actually held a copy in my hand, and sometimes I still don't believe it, but it exists, and it's now the book of the year at BYU, I heard. So that's sort of the origin story. The structure was sort of on the table from the beginning. I had explained to Lisa and to Deseret Book how I have come to understand the racial story. There were no restrictions in the first couple of decades, and then segregated priesthood and temples developed across the course of the 19th century in fits and starts, I think firmly in place by the early 20th century, solidified in place under Joseph F. Smith. And I had come to see the June 1978 revelation as, in fact, not taking us in a new direction, but actually restoring us to our original universalism. And I told Deseret Book that I imagined the book laid out in that very structure, that I wanted 3 parts so that readers could understand that. And that if nothing else that readers took from the book is just that the structure itself was perhaps different than how they might have thought about our own racial story. Sometimes the story continues to persist that the racial restrictions were in place from the beginning, that they trace through the foggy mists of time back into the eternities, and that human hands had no influence upon them. And I had come to understand a very different story. And so the very structure of the book, I wanted to reflect what I saw in the historical record. And there was no question from Deseret Book about that. They embraced that right from the beginning. The other question that was on the table was I shared with Deseret Book Brigham Young's 5th of February 1852 speech. It's drenched in racism. It comes out of a particular historical context, the 1852 territorial legislature, where Brigham Young is in a debate with Orson Pratt, who is a legislator and an apostle, and Brigham Young is governor and prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I told Deseret Book that they needed to read that speech and know that I would be quoting from it. And they couldn't come to me after the manuscript was written and tell me I couldn't say those things. They had to know up front how bad it was. And so that was all a part of the conversations that we had over time as we talked about the book. So the other aspects of the structure of the book, Deseret Book wanted short and accessible chapters that drive the narrative forward. This request, at least initially, because I'm a historian and you like to just contextualize everything and write long chapters, was frustrating. But I actually grew to love this part of it. And, even after I wrote the original manuscript and Deseret Books said you need to cut 10,000 words, I came to appreciate that process because it forced me to break the story down into bite-sized pieces and to be deliberate about how I view the development of the racial restrictions over time, and to select aspects of the racial story that move the story forward that I felt like readers needed to understand in order to understand how these restrictions came to be in place from the beginning. So that's credit to Deseret Book. This was a part of their design and actually forcing me to engage in that structure. I think I became convinced by the end that it was actually a good thing. I also then submitted the first 3 chapters to Lisa, and she's in the room. She can stand up for herself, but this is my memory of this, right? I submitted the first 3 chapters because I didn't want to get too far into the book and not have, feedback, so I didn't go too far astray. And Lisa is very diplomatic. She did not say what I'm going to say to you in this way. She was very pleasant with her response. But basically what I heard, and she was right, basically what I heard is you're keeping your audience at a distance, and this is still academic history. We need you in the book. You need to write as a Latter-day Saint to Latter-day Saints. So the current introduction in those first 3 chapters, really, I basically had to start over. And that was the most difficult part, was to inhabit the narrative as a Latter-day Saint and to write to my fellow Latter-day Saints. So that introduction that is currently in the book, then I wrote after I got that feedback from Lisa, and that introduction then was designed in the rewrite to unsettle our perhaps preconceived ideas about what race even is, using the Ritchie family as an introductory anecdote. I wasn't even aware of the Ritchie family. I received an email at the University of Utah one day after the Century of Black Mormons project became known, from a descendant of Nelson Holder Ritchie and his wife Annie Cowan Russell. And this descendant said to me, 72 members of my family have submitted for DNA, and we all have African ancestry in our DNA. We think it traces, these are white Latter-day Saints in the 21st century, I should say. We think it traces back to Nelson Holder Ritchie, and if so, we would love him honored in your database. So we did the research, and the Nelson Holder Ritchie family in and of itself then is illustrative of the fact that policing racial boundaries is impossible. Nelson Holder Ritchie was born into slavery, the product of a rape, more than likely, of a white enslaver and a black enslaved woman. And then, after he gains his freedom, fights in the Civil War on the side of freedom, opens a livery stable and hotel in Great Bend, Kansas, marries a white woman, and Latter-day Saint missionaries take room and board at that hotel. You know where the story goes. They move to Utah, and in 1909, he and Annie apply for temple admission, but are told no because he is racially barred from temple admission. And yet, all 9 of their children receive priesthood ordination and temple admission before June of 1978. They all pass as white. 2 generations of interracial relationships, and they all eventually pass as white. So the racial restrictions, in other words, illustrate, the Nelson Holder Ritchie family illustrate that the racial restrictions are impossible and they didn't work, right? And so we even say in the book then, right, that if one drop is the policy, and the church settles on a one-drop policy in 1907, if one drop is the policy, there's never been a period of Latter-day Saint history without black priesthood holders and temple attenders. So that's a part of the story that I wanted people from the beginning to recognize, right? What is race? And the Nelson Holder Ritchie family help us to grapple with that from the beginning and hopefully frame the context. And then the first 2 chapters just illustrate black converts in the U.S. North and the U.S. South. That Joseph Smith had articulated this gospel is to be preached unto every creature 5 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. It doesn't leave anyone out. And early Latter-day Saint missionaries seem to take that seriously. They are baptizing enslaved people and freed blacks. And that is a part of the gospel outreach. And I wanted that also to be the beginning. And then Deseret Book just asked me to end with how I make sense of this difficult history for myself, to transition from a historian to a pseudo-theologian, which made me nervous, but that's the end of the book. What do you do with this heavy history as a believer? And that's what I attempt to address in the end. In terms of the methodology, I approached the book with a central idea in mind, and this comes from what we term social history amongst historians. In the 1960s and 70s, sort of there's this pushback against, the traditional political history, the history told from the perspective of the white male leaders. And our own racial story, even my own religion of a different color, largely told from the perspective of white male leaders. When did these decisions happen? How did they come about? In the interim, the Century of Black Mormons Project provides opportunities to illustrate the ways in which those decisions from white male leaders played out in the pews amongst actual Black Latter-day Saints. And so a deliberate methodology in the book was to illustrate in the various chapters the ways in which those racial policies had real-life implications in the lives of Black Latter-day Saints in the pews. And that would not be possible without the Century of Black Mormons Project. And so the 1978 Revelation chapter is framed around Frida Lucretia McGee Ballou, a person who I have grown to love. She was baptized outside of Tylertown, Mississippi in 1909 in a creek, and she waited 69 years to be able to enter a Latter-day Saint temple. Within a month of the 1978 revelation, she's traveled 1,000 miles to be in the Washington, D.C. temple to be sealed by proxy to her beloved Rudolph, who has predeceased her. 69 years. Frida could answer the temple recommend questions exactly the same as a white person before June of 1978, and the white person be admitted, and Frida denied. That's called racism. So the June 1978 Revelation chapter is illustrated with her story for us to recognize. We sometimes refer to it as a priesthood restriction, but it also barred black men and women from the temple. And Frida is a perfect illustration of that. And so that's just an example of the methodology, trying to illustrate how these restrictions had real life implications. So I'm going to turn it over to Grace here. My overarching hope in writing this book is that it might prompt us as a people to engage with our racial past in meaningful ways. How do we root out racism if we are unwilling to examine its roots? I personally do not think it's possible. History has to be a part of the solution. We have to understand where we came from to fully understand who we are today. We are then better equipped to craft a future that is more wise, to use Moroni's words, because it learns from the imperfections of our collective past. Rather than deny or defend our racial past, what if we were willing to own it? What if we were willing to stand in places of empathy in matters of race in the 21st century because we have come to understand the consequences of our own racial history and are now prepared to use that history to shape a more inclusive future? That will forever be my hope. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and talk with you a little today. I'll keep it short and sweet because I know Dr. Reeve is the star, so I'm just here as a little amendum. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the research that I was able to do as a BYU student, particularly around issues of like race and the church history. And so I think what kind of started it all was I had discovered the identity of BYU's first black student. That previously we had all thought that the first black students to attend BYU were a group of African exchange students, primarily from Nigeria in the 1940s and 50s, and that Darius Gray would have been the first African American. But I, just by chance, was flipping through old BYU yearbooks. I was interested to see what was in there, and I came across Norman Wilson in the 1939 edition of the Banyan. And from there, because I had a lot of support from the department, I was able to continue research about his life and able to meet some of his descendants at a really, really, really beautiful time with them. I got to go out to Louisiana and meet them. And since they've donated some of their family materials to the library, so now there is a Norman Wilson collection in Special Collections that you can all view. That includes photographs, his wife's journal, and some other family items. But from that discovery, I wanted to know what more I could find in the yearbooks. I was like, if I found this one amazing thing, what else is in here? And so for my honors thesis, I decided to look through every edition of the BYU yearbook that went from 1911 to 1985 to see how students of color were represented and how they were shown. The paper focuses kind of on three main groups: Indigenous students, Black students, as well as Asian students. And there was a lot of really difficult material that I had to sift through, and it was really, I think, taxing. It took me a long time to go through it all, in particular BYU's very long history of blackface performances, very consistently up through the 1980s, and if you just Google on the internet, we're still having issues of this today, right? And so that in particular was really, I think, really heavy on me, I think. And then I have also had the opportunity to work on the BYU Slavery Project. I was a part of the first group of students that was involved with that. That was where I initially kind of had the chance to do more research about Norman Wilson and reach out to his family members. And since I've helped kind of develop some of the material that'll hopefully get put on the website eventually. But those are kind of just the basic things that I've worked on, I guess, BYU Slavery Project, my honors thesis, and my research on Norman Wilson. And I've also had the awesome chance to be able to work on Century of Black Mormons as well as a research assistant. But yeah, I just wanted to keep it short and sweet and introduce kind of some of my work, and I'm very excited to answer some of your guys' questions.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Is everybody good? Okay, sweet. Okay, so there's a lot of questions that we have written down. I want to start with one of the more common pushbacks that defenders of men like Brigham Young or Thomas Jefferson will give in racial contexts, the man of his times talking point. So the book really challenges that Brigham Young or Joseph Fielding Smith, or pick who you want, was just a man of their times. Why do you spend quite a bit of time dissecting that, pushing back on that? And why do you think that's an idea we so often hear? And Grace, I'd love to hear your input as well.
Yeah, so the last part of the book, Deseret Book asked me to address some of the what I consider to be the justifications we continue to use as Latter-day Saints to try to, in my estimation, give cover or justify racism rather than root it out. And so in my estimation, we have to confront those justifications. So historians, we do talk about presentism. This is something that I teach in graduate school, right? That the past is a foreign country, right? We have to try to understand it on its own terms. But my frustration is that sometimes I hear presentism being used to actually excuse or justify discrimination in the past as if there were no other options. And I find that to be a misuse of presentism rather than doing the work it takes to recover the past and understand it on its own terms. So if people in the past saw Black people as equal, and they did, Orson Pratt in the legislative session in 1852 was advocating for Black male voting rights. The legislators had choices in the past, in other words. Joseph Smith sanctioned the ordination of Black people. He was a product of the 19th century. We can't just simply say that racism was just endemic in the 19th century and therefore they could do nothing else, because there were Latter-day Saints who were doing something else. And so feels incumbent that we dismantle those kind of justifications because they give cover to racism rather than help us to root it out.
Yeah. And I'll share, I guess, my personal feelings of this, not necessarily as a historian, but just as a Latter-day Saint. So I guess a little bit of background. So I'm adopted, and so I didn't know anything about my family history until 2020, when I met my birth mother, and she shared with me our family history. And so for the first time, I had the chance to realize I didn't know I came from pioneer ancestry. I didn't know that was a part of my history. And I found out that my fourth great grandmother is Brigham Young's sister. And so that makes Brigham Young my fourth great uncle. That was not a fun, for most people, I think it's like, oh, I'm related to a prophet. That's so cool. And for me, I'm like, that's like the worst news you could have ever told me. Like, the person that would probably hate me the most is the person I'm related to. And so I had to spend a lot of time dealing with that, because it was kind of a traumatic moment for me because before I was able to kind of separate myself from it and be a part of it. And now I'm like, no, this is a part of my history and my family. And for me, when people try to excuse the racism of Brigham Young and other leaders, I feel that it's very unfair to them and where they are today. We believe in eternal progression and that these people are learning and are improving themselves, right? And I personally feel that Brigham Young is the person who's the most upset when we pin him to 200 years ago, or 100, whatever it is, right? When we pin him in the past, he is the most upset because he's trying to become better, and we can't hold him there. We have to allow these people to progress and become better. And I personally believe, and maybe it's what I tell myself to get through with it, but I think that when I, cross over, that the first person that's going to meet me in heaven is Brigham Young. And I truly, truly believe that the first thing he's going to say to me is that he's sorry. But that's my
Thank you so much for those responses. On that note, how do you regard Brigham Young and other prophets of the church? I'm a Latter-day Saint. You are both as well. How do you regard Brigham Young and other prophets of the church who perpetuated these ideas of racism following writing this book?
Yeah, so once again, those latter chapters, Deseret book asked me to address that, and it does raise automatically the question of prophetic fallibility. We don't have a doctrine of prophetic infallibility, even though we act like we do as Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saint leaders themselves tell us they are human, and yet we refuse to believe it. And so for me, it's okay to let them be human. It's okay for a prophet to be human. And it also, when sometimes I think we do ourselves and them a disservice when we put them on such high pedestals that they're completely out of reach. When we bring them down from the pedestal, that's someone that I can actually identify with, someone that is grappling and struggling with his or her own weaknesses, because I am on a stumbling walk with God myself. And it illustrates, right, that all of us are capable of profound good as well as all kinds of mistakes. And I see Brigham Young turning from his position in 1847, where he was on record as favorably aware of a black priesthood holder, to a position in 1852, and I think he's afraid of race mixing, which is endemic in the United States. And then he never reverts back. He sticks with the racial restrictions after that and invents a cursed racial identity for people of black African descent. Orson Pratt never buys it. We have no proof, he says, that black people are descendants of Cain. So it's okay to disagree because Orson Pratt disagreed and he was an apostle. They did not see eye to eye on this, and Brigham Young got it wrong. And I like what Grace said, right? I don't think he's somewhere in the eternity stuck on his position from 1852. And when we circle the wagons around him trying to defend that, I think we do him and us a disservice. So for me, it's okay for them to be human. It's okay for us to allow them to be human. I can then identify with them. I'm on a stumbling walk with God, and I can identify with the capacity for good and the capacity for bad that exists in all of us. We have a plan grounded in agency. If you give human beings agency, it's going to get messy. And our own racial story is messy, and it's grounded in people making human choices.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add, I think this is why it's so important for all of us to have our own relationship with God. You know, I sustain the prophets and leaders, and I look up to them and look for their advice and wisdom, but what's more important to me is my personal relationship with God and having personal revelation and building that connection with Christ. And I think that that's key, and that's built into our theology, and that's, I think, what the leaders want us to do too. And so having that own relationship for yourself, I think, can be very healing.
Great. Powerful words. Thank you so much. This next question is kind of following the same line of a more spiritual interpretation of the book. So this book suggests that engaging with gospel principles like agency, forgiveness, repentance, utilizing the atonement to grow, can help us understand, grapple with, and respond appropriately to history. Can you just share more about that?
Yeah, for me, there's sort of a personal journey that goes along with the academic journey. For as much as, academic history might feel detached, even if I'm writing academic history, right, there's the personal ramifications. And, the speeches that are included and used as sources, many of them, historians didn't have before as historical evidence. They were written down in 1852 by George Watt, who was the territorial scribe at the legislative session in Pittman shorthand, and then just sat in his collection untranscribed. And in doing research for Religion of a Different Color, the historical record was uneven on the legislative session, and so I wanted to get to the bottom of, is there a Pittman version of Brigham Young's speeches? And that question led to uncovering these speeches and then the new transcriptions. So for me then, getting back to the question, as a historian, right, you go into the archives and you come out. And this book represents my confession of what I found in the archives. And the profession that I was taught at this university is grounded in honesty and integrity to the sources. So I have an obligation to be honest and open with what I have found in the archives. And this book then represents my confession. And I hope that if we think of confession in a couple of ways, right? A confession as a historian, but also confession in terms of the repentance process. We have to, first of all, come to terms with what this looked like amongst ourselves. What does racism look like amongst Latter-day Saints? And history can show us what it has looked like in the past. Then we can confess, right? And we can engage in healing once we come to terms with it. And so that's how I see it as a historian and as a believer. It's heavy history, and we have to sit with the weight of it. And I've felt that crushing weight myself in grappling with these new pieces of evidence, and then trying to situate them within the historical context, but also within my theology.
I don't think I have much to add to that, so I'll let you go with the next question.
Perfect. Grace, since you already have the microphone, we have an especially for Grace section. Okay. A couple questions here. We'll just start with this one. Some Black Latter-day Saints feel uncomfortable talking about church history and the priesthood and temple restriction. Mm-hmm. How can we better understand that? And has your willingness to speak to issues of race changed over time?
Yeah. So the first part of the question about why it's difficult to talk about, or I think why people would rather not talk about it sometimes, is because it hurts. And more oftentimes than not, if we try to bring it up, there's people that aren't acting in good faith and will try to gaslight you or make you feel bad, make you feel like you're not a good Latter-day Saint, that you're being an apostate, like how dare you question. And so sometimes it's easier to just not talk about it at all. And so I think, that's the main reason. It hurts. We don't like talking about things that hurt. And that have to deal with our eternal salvation. I don't think people realize that as much, that the implications of the priesthood and temple ban. Like, to think that my ancestors or other black people in the past quite literally could not progress in the eternities, which essentially in our theology means that you're damned. If you can't progress, then you're damned. And so the theological implications of that to people it still hurts. And so we don't not want to talk about it because it's not important, but because it's hurtful. And when we talk about it to other groups, it just hurts even more. I guess for me, though, how it's changed over time is, I had no idea that there was a priesthood and temple restriction until I think I was about 17. So pretty close before I came to college. And initially, I was freaked out, and I came up with all sorts of excuses in my head to try to explain this and how this would possibly work. But over time, especially as I dove into history as a discipline, it's like I have to go and figure out for myself what's going on and actually look at the sources and not just take people's word for it. Because I was told a lot of the kind of racist explanations that you go over in your book and that you kind of disprove. And so I think that's what everybody needs to do, is go and look at the sources yourself and come to your own conclusions about these things.
And could you just elaborate on the importance of Latter-day Saints, regardless of color, diving into these sources themselves, grappling with the history of it all? Could you just elaborate on that a bit further? Yeah,
I think that's a huge part of our church identity and who we want to be. We should search through the best books, right? That's what D&C says, and we should, have our own faith and not rely on the faith or the knowledge of others. And so if anything, it's just a part of who we are in our tradition. I think that just like you would go into the scriptures if you had a question or you wanted to learn more about Christ, if you want to learn more about something historical, go look at the sources yourself and don't just trust what you've seen on the internet or trust what maybe you've heard in church. Go seek that out for yourself to find truth. Mm-hmm.
That was great. 10 out of 10. Thank you. Okay, this is for both of you. Both of your work, you guys suggest that often what we think is history is myth and our memory. Would you talk more about the differences and tensions between those two things, myth, memory, history?
Yeah, so I think an important point, chronological point in the solidification of the racial restriction is Joseph F. Smith. As leader of the church in 1908, he suggests that the racial restrictions were in place from the beginning. So that is history, right? But also false memory. And I see that as an important turning point because that new memory, right, becomes the collective Latter-day Saint memory. For the 21st century, that becomes the story. The racial restrictions were in place from the beginning. They've always been in place. God put them there. Humankind had nothing to do with it, and it will take a revelation to get rid of. Now, in fact, it does take a revelation to get rid of, but the other aspects of that misremembering then are inaccurate. And they're demonstrably inaccurate in Joseph F. Smith's own handwriting, because Joseph F. Smith interviewed Elijah Abel in 1879, and we have those notes. That's another new piece of evidence, right, that has emerged from the church history department. And he comes to John Taylor and says, look, this is Elijah Abel and his certificate dates and his memory of who gave him his washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple, and his memory that Joseph Smith told him he was entitled to the priesthood and all its blessings. And so his priesthood was allowed to stand, but not admitted into the temple, and yet went on a third mission. And another new piece of information, right, that people might gloss over in this because you might not know that it's new. But I didn't have this for religion of a different color, but found it in doing research for this book, that when Elijah Abel, is sent on a mission in 1883 as a 75-year-old man, after he's been denied the privilege of being sealed to Mary Ann, his beloved wife, who has passed away, he goes on a third mission, and Joseph F. Smith is the one that sets him apart, lays his hands on his head in 1883, sets him apart as a missionary, as a 75-year-old, sends him back to Ohio. He returns the following year and dies within 2 weeks. And so when Joseph F. Smith in 1908 says, the prophet Joseph himself declared Elijah Abel's priesthood null and void, that's a false memory, right? So I'm just bringing together the convergence of, okay, history, memory, and myth, and they all come together. And so what we have then is the emergence of a new collective memory for Latter-day Saints that the racial restrictions were in place from the beginning, but that's a memory that's demonstrably false in the handwriting of Joseph F. Smith himself and the fact that he had set Elijah Abel apart for his third mission. He knows his priesthood was not declared null and void because he was sent on a third mission, and Joseph F. Smith is the one that set him apart.
Yeah, I'm too upset to answer anymore about that question. Next question.
All right, we'll move on. So this book, it is a history of race and priesthood, the interrelation that those two have, but it's more than just an institutional history or a history of the church and its prophets dealing with this concept. Right? There's a lot of personal histories involved in this. Why was it important to include not only Darius Gray's foreword in this, but also in every chapter, the experience of individual Black Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, so I tried to address that in sort of the opening. That was a deliberate methodology in an effort to illustrate the ways that the racial restrictions played out in the lives of actual people so that we get to know people and also understand, hey, it's one thing to understand these from a policy perspective, from the perspective of white male leaders, detached from anyone who is actually living. But then when we can anchor those policy decisions in the lives of Black Latter-day Saints in the pews, all of a sudden, people, flesh and bone, right, actually have to live with the implications of those decisions. So, Rebecca Henrietta Foscue Bentley Meads, documented formerly enslaved woman who is sealed to her husband in 1863 and receives full temple privileges. And then a later stake president, right, is aware that a person of mixed racial ancestry had received her endowment, and there were others in his stake who were of mixed racial ancestry. And it helps us to understand then, okay, they're coming to terms with what comes to be called the one-drop policy, right? How much African ancestry can a person have and be admitted or kept out? And by 1907, church leaders settle on one drop, like the United States was settling on during a period of segregation. The state of Virginia, for example, settles on a one-drop policy to define who can be legally segregated or not. You can have 99 white ancestors and 1 black ancestor, and you're legally defined as black in the state of Virginia. And the church adopts its own one-drop policy. And so what does that mean, right? Well, knowing Rebecca's story, then we can anchor it to a human being. And we also then know the story of the Ritchie family and the fact that their family eventually passes as white. The grandson of an enslaver is a quarterback at BYU in 1945. The grandson of Nelson Holder Ritchie. I shouldn't say an enslaver, an enslaved man. Grandson of a formerly enslaved man. But the family has passed as white. He's a priesthood holder and BYU quarterback in the 1940s, right? So anchoring it to actual human experience then allows us to illustrate the complicated nature of trying to police racial boundaries and its impossibility.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that's, what you should do as a historian when you're doing work about people, especially like, discriminated populations that are discriminated against, is trying to center their voice in the narrative. And I think that's something that you did really well in this book. Is it's not a story about you, it's a story about these saints. And it's not a story about white members in the church, it's about these people and their lives and how they were affected by this. And that's what I think a lot, just in general, historians are trying to do, is center the voices of the people they're talking about, which can be hard because those aren't often found in archives. Sometimes you have to go out of your way to find descendants and family members, because that's not what institutions have supported, and you have to rely on oral histories and things like that. And so I think that's partially how the field of history is changing, is to try to do better scholarship by going from not just relying on traditional archival sources.
Ooh, these are great. I'm feeling it. I hope everyone else is too. Okay, I'm going to go with this one. History, including Latter-day Saint history, has often worked to, in historian Annette Gordon Reed's words, quote, limit the imaginative possibilities of blackness, close quote. How does the work both of you have done help to change that, and why is that important as we try to move forward?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about the article that Dr. Rue and Dr. Wood and I had published earlier this year. It was about how Black Latter-day Saints cope with being Black in a white space, and kind of their different tactics for that. And we came up, with a whole, kind of a spectrum and things. But I think the most important part of that was showing that Black Latter-day Saints are not a monolith, and to be Black and to be LDS is not one thing, and that you can't assume what people think or feel or how they feel about the church. And I think that was the biggest thing we tried to do with that paper, is that you have to look at everyone as an individual, and so often Black people have been denied individuality and have been described as one group that's usually genderless and just, and so letting these people speak for themselves and letting people be individuals, which I think is something that sometimes certain populations take for granted.
Well, I hope that the book itself illustrates the ways in which Latter-day Saint theology, as it entrenched around Blackness across the course of the 19th century, limited what that means for Black Latter-day Saints. It put up barriers, and it prevented them from full access to all of the gospel. And it violated Latter-day Saint scriptural norms and scriptural standards. So in a variety of ways, it put up barriers to Blackness. I think our racial history is a really troubling illustration of Annette Gordon Reed's point.
Okay, these are great answers. We have more questions that I'm sure people have written down in the audience. Please feel free to pass your note cards over this way to Dr. Deschweinitz as we just try to field some questions from the rest of the audience. In the meantime, I'm going to ask one more, if that's okay. Okay. Speaking of Blackness, there's evidence just throughout the book that, especially in the beginning of the race ban, the priesthood ban, you push back on the priesthood ban note a little bit, that it was more about maintaining an image of whiteness than it was about systematically removing anybody of African descent in the early stages of it. Would this be an accurate reading, or what would be your statement on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of looking at it. I think that's the fits and starts that take place across the course of the 19th century, right? I don't think there's a racial restriction in place at Brigham Young's first utterance. It has to take, it grows in accumulating precedent, and each succeeding generation unwilling to violate the precedent of the preceding generation. And then by the end of the 19th century, falsely remembering back, so there's that memory piece again, falsely remembering back about how it developed, and not actually going back and recovering historical evidence, but relying upon distant and faded memories and false memories. And so I think, I'm tending to agree with the question that, we can see it sort of developing and taking on a life of its own across the course of the 19th century, and grows in theological weight over the same time span until, like we talked about earlier, at the beginning of the 20th century, the new memory for the 20th century is that it's always been in place.
I don't have anything to add.
All right. Sure thing. Okay, so the last question before we move into some of our note card questions, it's about sources. So you use a mix of different types of sources as evidence as you interrogate historical myths and unfold the real story of what happened. Could you say more about some of the different types of evidences you use, how they work together, and what was perhaps most frustrating about some of those different sources?
Yeah, so what I learned in the BYU history department, right, is that historians rely on primary sources, and even if there is an existing narrative and there are limited primary sources, you should go back and read them for yourselves, because sometimes once a source enters the secondary sources, that's what gets continually passed around by future historians. And it's really important to go back and read the primary sources for yourself, and then to ask questions about them. And I had nagging questions about the existing narrative around 1852 that my sensibilities wouldn't let me rest. That prompted me to ask twice at the church history department about potential Pittman shorthand for Brigham Young's speeches in 1852. And my initial answer was no from the church history department. There aren't Pittman shorthand speeches, but they only responded to a request about 5th of January, and I asked about 5th of February as well. And so a follow-up question about 5th of February led to the uncovering of these. So primary sources are crucial, and for the ability to illustrate the chapters with Century of Black Mormons evidence, like Grace notes, a lot of times we don't have actual first-person voice from Black Latter-day Saints, and so historians are left with just the crumbs that sometimes people on the margins leave behind, and so it's how they enter the record in census records and church baptismal records and those kind of things, and so you're left to piece together those little bits of evidence and try to tell a story as best you can to honor and give dignity to the lives of people who left really few sources behind.
Okay. This is one of our first note card questions from the audience. As an African, I'm hearing you telling about histories, some of which I've never heard. So why isn't this knowledge shared more often? Or in other words, why isn't this taught more?
Yeah, I think part of it that Dr. Reeve talks about in the book is that Bruce R. McConkie says at BYU really close after the revelation that it doesn't matter what anybody said in the past, let's just ignore it, accept the revelation, and pretty much move on. And I think that's kind of, people really went with that advice and said, okay, we're not going to talk about it anymore. But by not talking about it, you don't understand what happened or how we got to this point, and it leads to people creating their own excuses or coming up with some of these false ideas. And so I don't think that's like the only reason, but I think that's a main reason, is that people really took that advice, and that leaves a lot of room for people to fill the gap, right? If you don't have an official narrative from the church saying this is why it was wrong, this is why we came to this conclusion, then people are going to come to their own conclusions, and I think that's partially why.
And the other thing that I'll just add to what Grace said, it becomes too uncomfortable to acknowledge that there were Black Latter-day Saints before June of 1978 because it implicates us in racism, and they have been collectively erased, right? So that's the Century of Black Mormons project. So these stories just aren't known. And so how do you tell stories when they've been lost? And Century of Black Mormons is designed to recover what's been lost. And that's the names and identities of our Black Latter-day Saint pioneers. Black Latter-day Saints have been a part of this faith from 1830 to the present. And when I started talking to people, friends and associates and people at the church history department about the project, people speculated, oh, this is going to be a small database, and you're not going to be able to find anyone. And we're talking about in the 20s or 30s at the most, because most people could name maybe 4 or 5 Black Latter-day Saints that they were aware of. I know it's still not a large number, but by the time we're done, we'll be between 300 and 400 in the database. and they'll have names, and they'll have the dignity of a biography on a digital website. And then we can include them in these type of histories. Their stories can be used to illustrate. Frida Lucretia McGee-Ballou, what a great opportunity to illustrate lesson on tithing. Or perseverance, for heaven's sake. I mean, there are all kinds of experiences and stories in that database already that simply the fact that they've just been erased and they're just not known is a part of the problem. And so the project is just designed to recover what was lost. And I hope then that we can get to know these people and we can then start diversifying our art and diversifying our pioneer stories and also confronting the racism that they teach us as well so that we can learn to be more wise.
This actually ties in really comfortably with our next question from the audience. As you've mentioned, the church and local communities have recently made efforts to promote Black history, partner with Black-centered organizations, and to memorialize Black Latter-day Saints. You're an example of that effort in and of itself. So how do you believe that current Latter-day Saints can use these tools and resources to dismantle false memories that you've brought up of past Latter-day Saints, to rebuild the foundation of our church with race relations between members, and the topic of race in the priesthood?
Yeah, I mean, I think step one is educating yourself about this history and going to the Black Mormons website and the Century of Black Mormons website and reading these biographies for yourself. Reading Dr. Reeve's book and doing, again, primary source research if you can yourself, so that when people bring up things in Elders Quorum or Relief Society or in class or whatever you're in, you can combat these narratives with facts and you can tell people the truth of what happened. I think that really is the starting point because, I mean, oftentimes I was at BYU or in church, the only Black person in the room, and it's really exhausting to try to explain everything myself. So it would have been really nice if maybe just once there was somebody else that could have said, no, that's not true, and that not making me do the work every single time. So yeah, I think step one is just starting local with your wards and in your classes and educating yourself.
I'll just give one example that is an unintended consequence of Century of Black Mormons. So on occasion, especially in February, Black History Month, we have been sent pictures of bulletin boards in local church buildings where someone in that congregation is taking the initiative and is drawing upon the Century of Black Mormons database to do a bulletin board for Black History Month about Black Latter-day Saint pioneers. This is just their own initiative. So that's one way that we can be a part of reconciliation and coming to terms with our own racial history.
Okay, I'm going to go with this question. I have a couple written down that we have from the audience. You've answered it in a sense, but just to ask it directly, do you believe that this dismantling could help future generations of the church, Black and otherwise, cope with the church's history and create a better future?
Yeah, that's absolutely my hope. So obviously I'm a historian. I'm biased towards this, but I feel like the narrative that Grace articulated, like the sense that okay, this is all in the past, let's just forget about it and move on, is 100% wrong. Joseph Smith was murdered in the past, let's forget about it. Handcart pioneers, why do we keep pulling those darn handcarts? That's all in the past, let's just move on. We can't collectively choose what past we are going to remember and forget. The good and the bad have to be a part of what we collectively remember, or we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we aren't grappling with where we're at in our own racial reconciliation journey, and we're not crafting a better future. So in my estimation, like I said, you can't root out racism without examining its roots. We have to understand what it looks like amongst us. And then I know of no better people than Latter-day Saints. When we put our mind to things like collectively, like we become true in living, to borrow from DNC 130. We become true in living. What better people to stand in places of empathy in the 21st century than Latter-day Saints who have come to recognize the consequences of our own racism and the soft form of racialization that was aimed at us, learned those consequences, and then we are willing to stand in places of empathy and lead out, like we've been called to do by President Nelson, lead out in abandoning actions and attitudes of prejudice and craft a inclusive Zionistic vision that I want to be a part of.
Yeah, and I just would add, I think that that's one of the church's biggest stumbling blocks right now, especially with people who can research things for themselves. I think back growing up, I didn't know that Joseph Smith had multiple wives. I didn't know how the Book of Mormon was translated. So many things I didn't know because of the way that we've gone about it. And artwork is really important, or just the narratives that we tell ourselves about our history. And I think that we just need to not be afraid of the truth. And just because if you tell people the truth, then there's nothing, and you learn it at 25, it's like my whole world is shattered. Whereas if you're taught this as a child and that's what you know, then you're like, oh, I've always known this. It's okay to be weird. We call ourselves a peculiar people all the time. But I don't think we want to be in actuality. And we try to be so normal and fit into this little box. But I just think just being honest is the biggest thing, is because people feel so... you do feel betrayed sometimes, because it's like, why was I taught this way? Why is the official artwork of the church looking this way when it's not true? And so I think that's the best thing that the church can do, is just changing some of those narratives and just being honest.
So I know that we're past 5 o'clock. I would love to engage with some more questions, but I think that we'll officially close, but invite you to stay and continue a little bit more of the conversation. So we'll thank Paul and Grace and Jonah. And if you have to go, then go ahead and quietly sneak out. So there were a number of audience questions centered around the idea of prophetic and leader fallibility. And in one of the chapters, Dr. Reeve specifically kind of dismantles kind of one of the quotes that is often kind of brought in that suggests kind of the infallibility of church leaders. And some of you are recognizing that we have both statements more recently by people like Elder Uchtdorf and Elder Holland who have affirmed that they are indeed human beings who make mistakes, and that past leaders have made mistakes. But then there are sometimes comments that seem to suggest something else. And so folks are interested in in continuing the conversation about this idea of fallibility, and recognizing too that in some ways it's easier the older you get to grapple with ideas about fallibility, and how do you do that, especially with youth?
Yeah, so Deseret Book explicitly asked me to address that question, especially around Wilford Woodruff's statement, which we like as Latter-day Saints to trot out and try to solve all kinds of thorny problems. And so that chapter exists because I was asked to include that chapter. And I think in its historical context, you can look at the chapter itself. What I'm trying to say there is what Wilford Woodruff is saying is he's defending the 1890 manifesto that starts the process of ending polygamy. He's defending it as a revelation in the face of accusations that he's leading the church astray because he's just fallen to political pressure and abandoning polygamy when the saints had sacrificed so much in its defense. And what Woodruff is saying is that actually God gave me a revelation, and he will not give me a revelation that will lead the church astray. Brigham Young never claims a revelation for the racial restrictions. That's the distinction that I think is important to make. And, in its context, that's what I hear Woodruff claiming and stating. And it fits with what he's saying in speeches as he goes around defending the manifesto. Remember, Latter-day Saint temples are on the chopping block. The Supreme Court in May of 1890 has opened the possibility of confiscating Latter-day Saint temples. And so what he's saying is, God showed me if we cling to polygamy, they're going to be running through our temples. We will abandon polygamy and preserve temple worship. And I received a revelation. He's defending it as a revelation, right? Brigham Young never claims a revelation. And yet that the racial restrictions grow in accumulating precedent like we've talked about, right? So I think, that's an important distinction. And we have a variety of church leaders. Brigham Young himself, sometimes depicted as an authoritarian, and he can certainly come across as really strong-willed, right? Says one of his greatest fears is that Latter-day Saints fall into blind self-security because they don't find out for themselves that they're being led by God. You can't simply cede your moral conscience over to anyone else. And we're led by a prophet. Those two things can both be true. And the Doctrine and Covenants in D&C 1, I think that's what Jesus is trying to teach us. We like to quote, the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth with which I, the Lord, am well pleased, speaking of the church collectively and not individually. We seldom quote the verses preceding that you will be led, my servants in the last days will be weak, they will be prone to error, and they will sin, and the church they are establishing is true and living. Not either or, but and. And that's the way that I deal with those questions of prophetic fallibility.
I think the only thing I would add is I think sometimes people ask a lot, well, why did it take until Spencer Kimball to finally have a revelation? And you said in the book, and I think President Kimball said it himself to his son, that you will never receive revelation that you're not ready to hear. And so I truly believe that it took somebody who was finally willing to confront themselves. And Kimball says himself, I was willing to die, defending that black people would never get the priesthood. I was willing to go to my death believing that. And he had to overcome some of his own biases and his own prejudice and racism to be able to hear, I think, what God has been saying ever since Brigham Young first started this forever ago. I think that the revelation has always been there, and it could have happened at any time. But it took one person that finally was willing to open their ear a little bit to hear it.
So the book highlights contingencies, right? Things weren't inevitable. They didn't have to turn out this way. And you identify a number of important turning points. You also kind of overturned the kind of progressive narrative about the church's racial past. That it's kind of this positive building toward, we have the restrictions, and then there's a positive building toward overturning those. And you tell a much more complicated stories. And there are some examples in here. Orson Pratt especially stands out as someone who is acting to try to put us on a different path. There's a question kind of about what ordinary members of the church might have done to change this history. Could you talk about that, and maybe also, along with that, highlight some of the things that you saw people doing? I think there are some really remarkable stories of people, especially Black Latter-day Saints, who are continually pushing back against the restrictions.
Yeah, so it's challenging simply because the Latter-day Saint tradition is hierarchical, and we do have, a sense of following the prophet, right? But we also have a sense of, that our policies need to be in alliance with our scriptures. And I see Black Latter-day Saints in particular, and there are more illustrations in the Century of Black Mormons project where they are writing and asking questions. So they're not, it's not just Elijah Abel, and it's not just Jane Manning James. There are other Black Latter-day Saints who are questioning. And there are white Latter-day Saints. Orson Pratt is the best example in the 19th century. He never buys Brigham Young's justification for the racial restrictions. And yet we still end up with the policy. So, that's the conundrum. But nonetheless, I think, there are examples that don't make it into this book, but exist, right? That people are writing in questions. They are asking, they're questioning. And I think if there's, enough collective questioning, we can see changes that take place. And I'm thinking of the November 2015 policy lasted 3 years rather than 130 years. And there were people who just actually spoke up and expressed, the discomfort that they felt around that. And these are very Orthodox Latter-day Saints who are just using their voices. And so I think there are ways that the Latter-day Saint tradition is both hierarchical and democratic at once, and there's kind of a dynamic tension between those two forces. And, if you're in the hierarchy, you don't have much of a church if no one's left to follow the prophet. And so there is that dynamic tension that exists, and I think we can, in very respectful ways, speak up, and there are those who did across the course of the racial restrictions.
I just have one example from my research that I really like to share that gave me a lot of hope. When I was going through old BYU newspapers in the 1960s, I can't remember her name, but her last name was McDaniels. She had a really long back and forth with the editor of the BYU student newspaper at the time. So it was when MLK was assassinated. And it was front page news on the Y News for, I believe, one day. It used to be published every single day. And it was front page news for one day, it was moved to the back page, and then it was off, I think, by day 3. And so she wrote to the editor and, saying, why is this happening? Like, this is something that needs to continue to be not only reported about, but reported about prominently. Their response was that it was dead news, and that there was more important things that needed to be discussed. But her last response, I think, was one of the most uplifting things and one of the best things that I've ever heard. But she said, the death of a good man is never dead news, as we testify to every Sunday. And then she said, I hope that one day freedom can ring from Y Mountain. And so I think that was a really hopeful instance for me, and that there have been people in the past that did say things, and I think it's important to bring those out too.
Great, thanks, Grace, especially for sharing that example, because there was a question that is kind of asking about, like, in the context of the civil rights movement, like, it's especially heartbreaking to see what the church does and doesn't do. But we do have some examples of BYU students who are standing up. I'd love to share that in my own work here in Special Collections, I ran across students who were writing to the university president questioning the racial restrictions and why there weren't more black students, or why there weren't black students at BYU. So, and that they were using their understanding of the scriptures from their religion classes and from their personal study to challenge the kind of norms and rules within the church. So I also wanted to ask how, like, most of the book presents clear evidence to back its points, but sometimes it suggests that what isn't in the historical record also matters. Could you talk about the importance of kind of both those things, like what we have evidence for and what we don't have evidence for, and kind of how that shapes the story?
Yeah, so in my estimation, you need evidence to suggest that the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions are in place from the beginning. And that there is an absence of evidence of that. And when I was writing Religion of a Different Color, I would check in with the Joseph Smith Papers team, because I wasn't finding anything traceable to Joseph Smith himself. So there's an absence, in other words, of evidence with Joseph Smith, and in fact then finding other sources that suggest there was no racial restriction. So we don't have Joseph Smith. So the absence is Joseph Smith himself. But then the other sources, the absence is Joseph Smith himself articulating a racial, priesthood, and temple restriction. The other sources that exist during his lifetime also then indicate, we have Phelps saying, we have no, as long as, now I'm forgetting the quote, but it's basically, there is no policy towards people of color in this church, right? So let prudence guide. And he's inviting Black Latter-day Saints to immigrate to Jackson County, Missouri, which has been defined as Zion, but warning them that if they do so, they're immigrating to a slave state, and there are codes in the Missouri State Code that govern their ability to move freely. So, it's both the existence of evidence and the absence of evidence that allows, I think, historians, myself included, to conclude we have no racial restrictions with Joseph Smith, and in fact, pretty profound evidence otherwise.
So several questions that are talking about what do you do with all of this? That especially when we're dealing with former prophets who are putting in place their own personal prejudices, and those are becoming part of church practice and for a time thought of as doctrine. How do you grapple with that? Just a little more about how you grapple with that, and how you continue to believe in a true and living church, and in the idea of a restoration, and in the context of kind of a church culture that doesn't always allow for democratic participation, and we might not have faith that our voices or even prayers sometimes are heard. Just something more about that.
Yes. So for me, this kind of messy history anchors me more solidly in faith. I've sort of abandoned certainty and embraced faith, and anchors me more solidly in Jesus Christ as the person who my devotion is centered on. That's how it's always supposed to have been. Once again, I love being a part of a religious tradition led by a prophet, but if we are only aiming at following a prophet, we're missing the mark. Scriptures warn us against trusting in the arm of flesh, and ultimately, even the arms of prophets are flesh. Our devotion is supposed to be anchored in Jesus Christ. He is mighty to save, and he is the only one, the Book of Mormon tells us, that can save us. His grace is sufficient for me, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the New Testament tells me. His grace is sufficient for me because I have weaknesses and challenges of my own. And so, messy history is what I expect as a historian. I don't expect it to get tidy once I start studying LDS history. I expect the same messiness. Human beings exercising agency, it will get messy. For me, it more firmly grounds me in my faith in Jesus Christ, where it was supposed to be all along. So I actually find fallible leaders to be refreshing, because it gives me hope that in my own fallibility, I have that Christ's grace is sufficient.
I would say pretty much the exact same thing, that while I sustain prophets and apostles and leaderships and I follow them, that I don't believe in them and that they are not the one thing that is the key to my relationship to God. And so for me, it's having that own personal connection to Christ and to my heavenly parents, and that's what comes first, and that's what will always come first.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we'll end asking you what your favorite story of early Black Latter-day Saints is from the research that you've done.
That's such a hard question.
Or it doesn't have to be favorite, one that stands out especially.
I don't know. I think one of my heroes would be Kathy Stokes, and just everything that she says just drips with wisdom. And her words kind of end Darius's like introduction to this book. And I think exactly what she says is true, is that as an American, you can believe whatever you want and you can be racist towards whoever you want. I guess that's your right to be. But if you're a member of this church, you lose the right to do that. Like, if you want to truly be a disciple of Christ, then you need to take that seriously and follow his teaching. So I love Kathy Stokes.
I think of maybe two. So William and Marie Graves, who are only briefly mentioned, but Artis Parshall, who's here, uncovered their story for the Century of Black Mormons project. They are converted in the Oakland, California congregation in 1909, and then in 1920 go to and worship in an integrated congregation. And that's their expectation until they go to Atlanta, Georgia in 1920 on vacation. And Marie actually invites two of her friends to go to the Latter-day Saint chapel with her. They show up, sit in the back, and are invited out by a white leader from the stand. And he lets them know that there's a colored line drawn in the South, and makes it clear to them that they're not welcome to stay in worship. And Marie is humiliated because she has gone to her own congregation, right? Found the right church, but found the wrong people, is how she writes it. And she's invited her friends to introduce them to the gospel, and they're saying, you belong to this church, and yet you're not allowed to stay in worship. She writes that in a letter to Heber J. Grant, the president of her faith. So what can we do? Well, she takes it right to the prophet. And William and Marie return to Oakland and pick up right where they left off, and Artis found the evidence of this, right? She's teaching a Relief Society lesson. She's bearing her testimony in Relief Society. She's paying her 10 cents and 25 cents charitable donations to the Relief Society for the rest of her life. And William outlives her by 10 years and leaves in his will the remaining proceeds from the settlement of his estate to his beloved Oakland congregation, where he worshiped an integrated congregation for the rest of his life. They tug on my heartstrings. And the Church History Museum has commissioned a portrait of William and Marie, which is now completed, was painted by Marlena Wilding, a graduate of BYU. And the hope is, the plan is that copies of this are going to hang in the chapels in the Atlanta Stake and in the Oakland Stake, bringing about racial reconciliation. But I think William and Marie, towards the top of my list, and we already mentioned Frida. She's also my favorite, 69 years, and can't go to the temple without thinking about Frida.
Hey, thank you.